Welcome to another story on Cheating Tales Lab. We're so happy to have you here, and today's story is one we think you'll really enjoy. So without further ado, let's begin. Zephyr Blackwood's keys jangled as he fumbled with the lock. A bouquet of blue orchids cradled in one arm and a small velvet box tucked securely in his pocket. The house was unnaturally quiet as he stepped inside, the silence pressing against his ears like a physical force. "Lyra," he called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. No answer. Something was off. Zephyr's eyes darted around, taking in the subtle signs of disturbance. A photo frame lay face down on the side table, its usual place marred by its absence. As he moved further into the house, the wrongness intensified. In the kitchen, Lyra's favorite mug lay shattered on the floor, its pieces scattered like fallen stars. Her purse sat abandoned on the counter, its contents undisturbed. The orchids suddenly felt heavy in his hands, their delicate petals a mockery of the celebration he'd anticipated. Zephyr's heart raced as he made his way to the living room. Lyra's phone rested on the coffee table, its screen a web of cracks. He picked it up gingerly, as if it might bite him. The cracks spread outward from the center, like the tendrils of a sinister conspiracy reaching into his life. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his own phone and dialed Iris Zhao's number. Lyra's best friend picked up on the third ring, her voice pitched oddly high. "Hello? Zephyr? Iris, have you seen Lyra? She's not home, and things look strange." There was a pause, too long to be natural. "And no, I haven't seen her. Is everything okay?" Zephyr's suspicion grew with each stuttered word. Iris was hiding something, her usual poise crumbling under the weight of whatever secret she was keeping. "Are you sure? You haven't heard from her at all?" "I'm sorry, Zephyr. I really don't know where she is." The words tumbled out too quickly, each one another brick in the wall of deception. After hanging up, Zephyr found himself in their bedroom, drawn there by some instinct he couldn't name. His eyes fell on Lyra's jewelry box, an ornate wooden thing they bought on their honeymoon. Something niggled at the back of his mind. He opened it, fingers tracing the familiar contours. Then he paused. Was that a seam where there shouldn't be one? Pressing gently, he felt a click, and a false bottom sprang open. Inside lay a burner phone, its cheap plastic a stark contrast to Lyra's elegant jewelry. Zephyr's hand shook as he turned it on. The messages that filled the screen were in a code he didn't recognize, a fact that chilled him to the bone. He was a top cryptographer, for God's sake. If he couldn't crack it at a glance. The shrill ring of his phone cut through his thoughts like a knife. Detective Nolan Frost's gruff voice filled his ear before he could even say hello. "Mr. Blackwood, we found your wife barely alive in a motel. You need to come now." The words hit Zephyr like a physical blow. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the dresser. "What happened? Is she—" "Just get here," Frost interrupted, his tone grim. "There's more to this than meets the eye." As Zephyr rushed out the door, the velvet box fell from his pocket forgotten. The sapphire necklace inside glinted in the fading light, a testament to the love he thought he knew. The Starlight Motel loomed before Zephyr, its neon sign flickering weakly in the twilight. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burnt rubber and gasoline, a pungent cocktail that made his stomach churn. Police cars formed a barrier around the scene, their lights painting the world in alternating flashes of red and blue. An ambulance stood nearby, its back doors open like the maw of some patient beast. And there, wrapped around a lamppost like some grotesque modern art installation, was a mangled red Porsche. Detective Frost materialized out of the chaos, his weathered face a mask of grim determination. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, nodding in greeting. "Your wife was in an accident with Caspian Vex, her ex from college. He was driving under the influence." Zephyr's mind reeled. Caspian Vex? Lyra had never mentioned him. Frost's next words hit even harder. "But there's more to this than meets the eye, Mr. Blackwood." Before Zephyr could press for details, movement caught his eye. Paramedics were wheeling out a stretcher, and on it lay Lyra. Her face was pale, marred by ugly bruises that stood out like accusatory fingers pointing at some unseen culprit. Their eyes met across the chaos of the crime scene. Lyra reached out weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Honey, I'm so sorry. It was an accident." The words seemed to carry a weight beyond their simple meaning, laden with secrets and lies. Zephyr turned away, unable to bear the sight of her. His gaze fell on a briefcase among the scattered debris, its contents spilling out onto the asphalt. He caught glimpses of what looked like classified documents before a uniformed officer hurried to gather them up. As he made his way back to his car, a hushed conversation between two paramedics reached his ears. "Did you see those badges? High-level clearance, man." "Yeah, and those encrypted hard drives? What the hell were they doing here?" Zephyr's mind whirled, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to take shape. What had Lyra gotten herself into? And more importantly, what had she dragged him into along with her? The sterile corridors of the National Cyber Defense Agency headquarters seemed colder than usual as Zephyr made his way to his office. The events of the past few hours had left him feeling like a stranger in his own life. With practiced ease, he bypassed the standard security protocols and accessed the agency's personnel files. His fingers flew over the keyboard, searching for a name he'd never thought he'd need to know. Caspian Vex. There it was. Hired 3 months ago as a cybersecurity consultant. Zephyr's eyes narrowed. It was a vague title, the kind used when someone needed access but didn't want to draw attention. Red flags unfurled in his mind, each one a warning he'd failed to heed. Burning the midnight oil? Zephyr nearly jumped out of his skin. Raven Coe stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in his disheveled appearance and the classified files on his screen. "Raven, He hesitated, weighing his options. Then, making a decision, he gestured for her to come in. "I need your help, but this stays between us." In a secure room, away from prying eyes and ears, Zephyr laid out the situation. Raven listened, her brilliant mind already connecting dots he hadn't even seen. "We need to look at the access logs," she said, her fingers dancing across a keyboard. "If what you're saying is true, there should be a pattern." Hours passed in a blur of code and caffeine. As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, they had their answer. A series of minor but strategic security breaches over the past 6 months, all traced back to Zephyr's credentials. But the timestamps. "I wasn't even in the building for some of these," Zephyr muttered. Raven's voice was grim. "Someone's been using your access, and doing a damn good job of covering their tracks." They dug deeper, following digital breadcrumbs through the labyrinth of the agency's systems. And then they found it. Fragmented connections between Caspian Vex and chatter about a group known as the Cypher Syndicate on the dark web. "I've heard whispers about them," Raven said, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. "They're planning something big, a cyber attack that could cripple entire nations." The implications hit Zephyr like a physical blow. Lyra had been using their marriage as a cover, feeding classified information to the Cypher Syndicate through Caspian. But why? What could possibly drive her to betray not just him, but their entire nation? With trembling hands, he pulled out the burner phone he'd found in Lyra's jewelry box. The encrypted messages that had baffled him earlier now seemed to mock him with their secrets. "Can you break this?" he asked Raven, handing her the phone. Her eyes lit up with the challenge. "Give me an hour." 53 minutes later, Raven's triumphant cry broke the tense silence. "I'm in." Zephyr leaned over her shoulder, his heart pounding. As the decrypted messages filled the screen, he felt the last remnants of his world crumble around him. Lyra wasn't just having an affair or stealing information. She was a deep-cover operative for the Cypher Syndicate, planted years ago to infiltrate the agency through him. Their entire relationship, their marriage, their life together, it had all been a lie. As the weight of the betrayal crashed over him, Zephyr gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. He'd thought he was living a love story. Instead, he'd been an unwitting pawn in a game of international espionage. And now, it was time to change the rules. The antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor assaulted Zephyr's nostrils as he made his way to Lyra's room. A manila envelope containing divorce papers was tucked under his arm, its weight a constant reminder of the betrayal that had shattered his world. Room 307. Zephyr paused at the door, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He pushed it open, the hinges squeaking softly as if protesting the intrusion. The sterile whiteness of the hospital room was a stark contrast to the warmth their home once held. Lyra lay in the bed, looking small and vulnerable in her hospital gown. Her eyes widened as she saw him, a mix of emotions flashing across her face. Relief, fear, and something else Zephyr couldn't quite place. "Zephyr," she began, her voice cracking. "I can explain." He cut her off with a raised hand, his face an impassive mask. Without a word, he placed a manila envelope on her bedside table. The soft thud it made seemed to echo in the silence of the room. Lyra's eyes darted to the envelope, then back to Zephyr. Understanding dawned on her face, followed quickly by panic. "Please, just let me." The door opened again, cutting off her plea. Caspian Vex sauntered in, his arm in a sling and a nasty gash running across his forehead. The smug grin on his face faltered slightly as he registered Zephyr's presence. "Well, well," Caspian drawled, recovering quickly. "If it isn't the man of the hour." Zephyr's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Caspian's next words hit like a sledgehammer. "I suppose introductions are in order. Zephyr Blackwood. Meet Lyra's handler in the Cypher Syndicate." "Oh, wait, that's me." Lyra's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. Zephyr's mind raced, processing this new information. He'd suspected, of course, but hearing it confirmed so brazenly. "What do you want?" Zephyr managed to grit out, his voice low and dangerous. Caspian's smirk widened. "Straight to business. I like that." He lowered himself into a chair, wincing slightly as the movement jostled his injured arm. "We want your cooperation, Zephyr. Your expertise, your access. In return, we don't expose certain indiscretions from your past." Zephyr's blood ran cold. How could they possibly know about... "That's right," Caspian continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Lyra here discovered a rather interesting ethical breach from your early days at the agency. Wouldn't want that getting out, would we?" Zephyr's face remained impassive, but his mind was working overtime. He needed time, needed to think. I need some time to consider this," he said, allowing a hint of vulnerability to creep into his voice. Caspian nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Take all the time you need. We'll be in touch." As Zephyr turned to leave, his hand brushed against the get-well card in his pocket. In one smooth motion, he placed it on Lyra's bedside table, right next to the divorce papers. The high-tech listening device hidden within would pick up every word spoken in this room. With a final, inscrutable look at Lyra, Zephyr walked out, the first step of his counter-strategy set in motion. The game was on, and he intended to win. Artemis Steele's office was a fortress within a fortress. Zephyr had been here countless times before, but never like this. Never with the weight of betrayal and conspiracy hanging over his head. Director Steele herself was a formidable presence, her sharp eyes seeming to pierce right through him as he laid out everything he'd uncovered. The burner phone, the security breaches, the Cypher Syndicate, Lyra's true identity. He held nothing back. As he finished his report, Steele leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled under her chin. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Finally, she spoke. "This goes deeper than we ever imagined." Her eyes narrowed as she absorbed the information. "We need to turn this to our advantage." Zephyr nodded, relieved that she believed him. "What do you suggest, Director?" A slow, predatory smile spread across Steele's face. "We make you a double agent, Mr. Blackwood. Feed false information to Lyra and Caspian. Use them to unravel the entire Cypher Syndicate operation from the inside out." The plan was daring, dangerous, and exactly what Zephyr had hoped for. "I'm in," he said without hesitation. Over the next few weeks, Zephyr lived a precarious double life. To Lyra and Caspian, he appeared to be a reluctant accomplice, sharing carefully selected tidbits of classified information. Each piece of data was meticulously crafted misinformation, designed to mislead the Cypher Syndicate while appearing valuable on the surface. Lyra, now out of the hospital, watched him with a mix of suspicion and hope. Zephyr played his part to perfection, allowing just enough reluctance and resentment to show through to make his cooperation believable. Caspian, for his part, seemed to revel in his perceived victory. His smug grins and condescending pats on the back made Zephyr's skin crawl, but he endured it all for the sake of the mission. One night, as Zephyr sat in his darkened living room, monitoring the feed from the listening device he'd planted in Lyra's hospital room, he overheard a conversation that chilled him to the bone. "Everything's going according to plan." Lyra's voice came through, tinny but clear. "Zephyr's cooperating, just like you said he would." "Good," a gruff male voice replied. Zephyr's breath caught in his throat as he recognized it. Detective Nolan Frost. "Keep him in line. We can't afford any slip-ups this close to the endgame." Zephyr's mind reeled. Detective Frost, the man in charge of investigating the Motel incident, was on the Cypher Syndicate's payroll. The conspiracy ran deeper than he had ever imagined. As the days wore on, the toll of his deception began to show. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. His movements became jittery and unpredictable. Raven, ever observant, couldn't help but notice. "Zephyr," she said one day, cornering him in a secure room at the NCDA. "What's going on with you? And don't tell me it's nothing. I know you better than that." For a moment, Zephyr considered brushing her off, but the concern in her eyes, the genuine worry in her voice, broke through his defenses. In a moment of vulnerability, he found himself confiding in her about the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. "I feel like I'm losing myself," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every lie, every piece of false information I feed them, it's like I'm chipping away at who I am." Raven listened silently, her presence a comforting anchor in the storm of his emotions. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You're not losing yourself," she said firmly. "You're fighting for what's right, even when it's hard. That's who you are, Zephyr. Don't ever forget that." Her words, simple yet powerful, gave Zephyr the strength to continue. As he navigated this treacherous path, Raven's support became his lifeline, a reminder of why he was fighting in the first place. The abandoned subway station loomed before Zephyr, its entrance a gaping maw in the side of a decrepit building. Graffiti covered every available surface, and the air was thick with the musty smell of decay and neglect. Zephyr adjusted his glasses, ensuring the hidden camera was in place. The live stream to the secure NCDA server was already running, capturing every detail of this clandestine meeting with the Cypher Syndicate leaders. As he descended into the bowels of the station, the dank atmosphere closed in around him. Flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the sound of dripping water echoed ominously in the distance. The syndicate members were already gathered, their faces partially obscured by the poor lighting. Zephyr recognized Caspian and Lyra among them, along with a few others he'd seen in surveillance photos. As the meeting progressed, Zephyr's blood ran cold. The syndicate's ultimate plan was far more ambitious and devastating than anyone had anticipated. They intended to crash the global financial market using stolen algorithms, creating worldwide economic chaos on an unprecedented scale. Zephyr kept his face impassive as he absorbed this information, but inside, his mind was racing. The implications were staggering. Millions of lives would be affected, entire nations brought to their knees. He knew then that the stakes of his mission had just been raised exponentially. In the days that followed, Lyra made several attempts to rekindle their relationship. Her touches, once a source of comfort and joy, now felt like poison on Zephyr's skin. Her words of love and regret rang hollow in his ears. I never meant to hurt you, she whispered one night, her hand on his arm. You have to believe me, Zephyr. Everything I've done, it was for a greater cause. Zephyr played along, forcing himself to respond with just the right mix of hesitation and lingering affection. All the while, he documented every interaction, building a case that would eventually bring the entire syndicate crashing down. Caspian, meanwhile, grew increasingly paranoid. Zephyr often caught him watching with narrowed eyes, as if trying to peer into his very thoughts. I want round-the-clock surveillance on Blackwood, Caspian barked at one of his underlings. If he so much as sneezes, I want to know about it. This new level of scrutiny complicated Zephyr's covert activities. Communication with Director Steele and Raven became a dangerous game of cat and mouse. He found himself employing ever more creative methods to pass along crucial information without detection. Late one night, as Zephyr was in the middle of transmitting a particularly sensitive piece of intel to Director Steele, disaster nearly struck. The door to his office began to open, the handle turning agonizingly slowly. Zephyr's heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to hide the evidence of his true allegiance. Just as the door swung open, revealing one of Caspian's men, Raven's voice came through on the intercom. Zephyr, I need you in the lab right away. We've got a situation with the firewall. The syndicate member hesitated, then grudgingly allowed Zephyr to leave. As he hurried down the corridor, Zephyr sent a silent thank you to Raven for her perfectly timed intervention. Later, as he pored over some of the syndicate's encrypted communications, Zephyr made a chilling discovery. Hidden within the complex codes and ciphers was evidence suggesting that the Cipher Syndicate had infiltrated the highest levels of government. But it was the next revelation that truly shook him to his core. As he dug deeper, following a trail of digital breadcrumbs, he uncovered something that made his blood run cold. The evidence pointed to a mole within the upper echelons of the NCDA itself. Zephyr sat back in his chair, his mind reeling from the implications. The enemy wasn't just out there. It was here, within the very walls he'd sworn to protect. As he stared at the damning evidence on his screen, one thought echoed through his mind. Who could he trust now? The air in the NCDA's secure conference room crackled with tension. Zephyr Blackwood stood at the head of the table, his eyes hard as flint as he surveyed the small group of trusted operatives before him. Director Artemis Steele sat to his right, her face an impassive mask that betrayed nothing of the high-stakes game they were about to play. Ladies and gentlemen, Zephyr began, his voice low and steady, what I'm about to propose is not only dangerous but technically illegal. If anyone wants to leave now, there will be no repercussions. No one moved. Zephyr nodded, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Good. Let's begin. Over the next hour, Zephyr laid out the bones of an elaborate sting operation. The centerpiece? A fictitious quantum encryption server that would supposedly house the world's most sensitive financial data. We're going to create a honeypot so sweet the Cipher Syndicate won't be able to resist, Zephyr explained, his fingers dancing across a holographic display as he spoke. This server will be our bait, our trap, and our key to bringing down the entire operation. Director Steele leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing as she absorbed the details. And how do you propose we leak this information without arousing suspicion? Zephyr's smile was cold. Through me. I'll feed the information to Lyra and Caspian, bit by tantalizing bit. They think they have me under their thumb. It's time we use that to our advantage. As the meeting progressed, the plan took shape. Carefully controlled leaks, strategically placed vulnerabilities, all designed to draw the Cipher Syndicate into a trap of the NCDA's making. Over the next few weeks, Zephyr became a master of misdirection. Every conversation with Lyra, every clandestine meeting with Caspian, became an opportunity to drop hints about the quantum encryption server. I overheard something interesting today, Zephyr would say, his voice carefully modulated to sound both nervous and excited. A new server, supposed to be unhackable. It's got everyone at the agency on edge. He watched as the bait was taken, hook, line, and sinker. The Cipher Syndicate mobilized their most skilled hackers, pouring resources into cracking what they believed to be the ultimate prize. Zephyr stood in the shadows of the NCDA's main server room, watching as technicians scurried about, setting up the elaborate ruse. Fake servers hummed, their blinking lights a testament to the agency's attention to detail. Everything had to be perfect. The slightest inconsistency could blow the entire operation. As he observed the controlled chaos, a familiar voice cut through the noise. Zephyr. He turned to see Lyra approaching, Caspian close behind. Their faces were masks of determination and barely concealed greed. "We need access to the server room," Lyra said, her voice low and urgent. "The quantum encryption server. You're going to get us in." Zephyr felt a chill run down his spine. This was it, the endgame. He nodded slowly, playing the part of the reluctant accomplice to perfection. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But after this, we're done. I want out." Caspian's laugh was cold and mirthless. "Oh, Zephyr, you're in this for the long haul now. There's no getting out." As Zephyr led them towards the heart of the trap, he couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. Something was off. The Syndicate's movement seemed too precise, too well-informed. It was as if they knew exactly where to step to avoid the NCDA's carefully laid snares. A chilling realization struck him like a physical blow. There was a mole on his team. Someone privy to the details of the sting operation was feeding information to the Syndicate. As he punched in the access code to the server room, Zephyr's mind raced. The trap was sprung, but who was really caught in its jaws? He had mere moments to identify the traitor and salvage the operation before everything fell apart. The heavy door swung open with a soft hiss, revealing the blinking lights and humming servers within. As Lyra and Caspian stepped eagerly into the room, Zephyr's hand hovered over the concealed panic button in his pocket. One press, and the entire building would go into lockdown. But before he could act, a voice from behind froze him in his tracks. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Blackwood." Zephyr turned slowly, his blood running cold as he recognized the speaker. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place, revealing a picture far more twisted than he could have imagined. The server room, once a sanctuary of order and control, had become a battleground. Zephyr's mind raced, processing the unfolding chaos with the cold precision of the master cryptographer he was. The Syndicate's uncanny knowledge of their countermeasures suddenly made horrifying sense. Zephyr's eyes darted around the room, cataloging every face, every micro-expression. The mole was here, in this very room. But who? A bead of sweat trickled down his spine as he realized the magnitude of the situation. The entire operation was unraveling faster than he could patch the holes. He was going to have to improvise, relying on years of experience and the razor-sharp instincts honed through countless cyber battles. "Impressive setup, Zephyr." Caspian's voice dripped with smug satisfaction. "Almost had us fooled. Almost." Lyra stepped forward, her eyes cold and calculating. Gone was the vulnerability she'd shown in the hospital. This was the real Lyra, the deep-cover operative who had played him for years. "Did you really think we wouldn't see through your little charade?" she asked, her voice like silk over steel. Zephyr's retort died on his lips as a new figure entered the fray. Detective Nolan Frost sauntered into the server room, a predatory grin on his weathered face. "Surprised to see me, Blackwood?" Frost chuckled. "You should have dug a little deeper into that motel incident. Might have saved you some trouble." The trio converged on Zephyr, backing him against the humming servers. They thought they had won, their victory assured by treachery and deceit. But Zephyr Blackwood was far from beaten. "You're right," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I should have dug deeper. Into all of you." With a swift motion, Zephyr pulled out a small device from his pocket. The Syndicate members tensed, expecting a weapon. Instead, a holographic display flickered to life, filling the air with streams of data. "What you're seeing," Zephyr explained, his confidence growing with each word, "is every piece of intelligence I've gathered on the Cypher Syndicate over the past weeks. Every conversation, every transaction, every dirty little secret. Caspian's face drained of color. Lyra's eyes widened in disbelief. Frost's hand inched towards his concealed weapon. The real sting operation, Zephyr continued, was layers deep. This server room, it's a sophisticated containment system. The moment you stepped inside, you activated a dormant protocol. We're locked in, and every word you say is being recorded and transmitted to law enforcement agencies worldwide. The realization of their predicament dawned on the syndicate members' faces. They had walked right into a trap far more intricate than they could have imagined. Lyra, ever the quick thinker, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Her face softened, tears welling up in her eyes. "Zephyr, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "What we had, it wasn't all a lie. I grew to love you. Truly. We can still have a life together. Just give me a chance to explain." For a moment, just a fleeting instant, Zephyr's resolve wavered. The memory of happier times, of a love he thought was real, threatened to overwhelm him. But then he remembered the betrayal, the years of lies, the lives put at risk for the syndicate's twisted ambitions. His expression hardened. "No, Lyra," he said, his voice cold. "We can't." With a subtle hand motion, Zephyr activated the final phase of his countermove. Alarms blared throughout the building as armed NCDA agents began to swarm towards their location. Panic erupted in the server room. Caspian lunged for the door, only to find it sealed shut. Frost drew his weapon, his eyes darting wildly for an escape route. Lyra stood frozen, the full weight of her actions finally crashing down upon her. In the chaos, the three managed to slip past Zephyr, making a break for the emergency stairwell. They disappeared through the door, just as the first NCDA agents rounded the corner. Zephyr gave chase, his intimate knowledge of the building's layout guiding his pursuit. The hunt was on, and he was determined to see it through to the bitter end. Rain lashed against the windows of the NCDA headquarters as Zephyr tore through the labyrinthine corridors. His footsteps echoed off the sterile walls, mingling with the distant shouts of agents and the wail of alarms. He could hear them ahead, Lyra, Caspian, and Frost, their desperation palpable in the frantic pounding of their feet. But Zephyr had the home field advantage. He'd walked these halls countless times, knew every shortcut and hidden passage. As they approached a T-junction, Zephyr cut left, taking a maintenance corridor that would bring him out ahead of the fleeing trio. He burst through a door just as they rounded the corner, nearly colliding with Caspian. The look of shock on their faces was almost comical. Almost. "End of the line," Zephyr panted, blocking their path. Frost raised his weapon, but Lyra pushed his arm down. "No, there's still a way out. The roof." They turned and ran, leaving Zephyr to give chase once more. Up they went, flight after flight of stairs, the storm growing louder with each floor they climbed. Finally, they burst onto the roof. The rain came down in sheets, drenching them instantly. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark, electric blue. Lyra spun to face Zephyr, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wild. "Zephyr, please," she shouted over the howling wind. "You have to listen to me. I'm pregnant. It's yours." The words hit Zephyr like a physical blow. He faltered, his mind reeling. Could it be true? After everything, could there be an innocent life caught in the crossfire of their deception? Caspian seized the moment of distraction. "Enough of this shit," he snarled, pulling out a small remote. With the press of a button, the whir of rotors cut through the storm. A helicopter rose into view, hovering at the edge of the roof. Their escape route. "It's over, Zephyr," Frost called out, already moving towards a chopper. "You lost. Accept it." But Zephyr wasn't done. Not by a long shot. As Lyra and Caspian made for the helicopter, Zephyr reached into his pocket and activated a device of his own. To anyone watching, it would have looked like he was simply letting them go. They didn't know that every word spoken in that helicopter would be broadcast to law enforcement agencies worldwide. Their escape vehicle had become a flying confession booth. Zephyr stood in the rain, watching as the helicopter lifted off into the stormy night. Water streamed down his face, indistinguishable from the tears he refused to acknowledge. A hand on his shoulder startled him. He turned to see Director Steele, her usually immaculate suit soaked through, her eyes glinting with a fierce pride. "It's done," Zephyr said, his voice barely audible over the fading sound of rotors. "They thought they could use me, betray me, and walk away. But they underestimated what I'm capable of. This is the price of their deceit." Steele nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's get you inside. There's still work to be done." As they turned to leave the roof, Zephyr cast one last look at the storm-tossed sky. The helicopter was gone, swallowed by the night. But he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where the echoes of betrayal would resound through the digital realm, changing the landscape of cybersecurity forever. With a deep breath, Zephyr squared his shoulders and followed Steele back into the building. The storm raged on, but within him, a calm had settled. He had faced his betrayers, confronted his past, and emerged stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. The war against the Cypher Syndicate was far from over, but tonight, Zephyr Blackwood had struck a decisive blow, and he would not rest until the last echoes of their betrayal had been silenced. The federal courthouse loomed before Zephyr Blackwood, its imposing facade a stark reminder of the gravity of the proceedings about to unfold within. 2 months had passed since that rain-soaked confrontation on the NCDA rooftop, but the weight of those events still pressed heavily upon his shoulders. As he ascended the steps, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Zephyr kept his gaze forward, his face an impassive mask. He was the star witness in the trial against the Cypher Syndicate, and the world was watching. The courtroom fell silent as Zephyr took the stand. His eyes swept across the room, landing on Lyra and Caspian. They sat among the other arrested syndicate members, their prison jumpsuits a far cry from the polished personas they once projected. Lyra's gaze met his, a mixture of defiance and something else, regret perhaps? Caspian, on the other hand, glared with undisguised hatred. Over the next several days, Zephyr's testimony unfolded like a complex algorithm. He presented decrypted communications, detailed financial trails, and played the damning confessions recorded from the rigged helicopter. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the syndicate's coffin, exposing the full extent of their operations. The media dubbed it the trial of the century. Zephyr's dual role as victim and hero captivated the public imagination. Despite the intense pressure and scrutiny, he remained composed, his testimony clear and unwavering. During a recess, Zephyr found himself alone in a private chamber, his mind still racing from the morning's cross-examination. The door opened, and Lyra was escorted in by a guard. Her eyes, once so familiar, now seemed to belong to a stranger. "Zephyr," she began, her voice soft, "I know you probably won't believe me, but I need you to know. What I told you on the roof about being pregnant, it wasn't entirely a lie. I thought I was at the time." Zephyr's face remained impassive. "I know the truth, Lyra. I saw your medical records from the hospital after the crash. You were never pregnant." The color drained from Lyra's face as she realized her final deception had been unraveled before it even began. Without another word, she was led away, leaving Zephyr alone with the echoes of her lies. When the verdict finally came down, it fell like a hammer blow. Caspian, identified as a key syndicate operative, was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Lyra, despite her attempts to paint herself as a reluctant participant, received 25 years. The syndicate's leader, a shadowy figure finally unmasked, was given a life sentence. In the aftermath of the trial, as the dust began to settle, Zephyr found himself at a crossroads. An offer had been extended, the chance to lead a new international cybersecurity task force. It was an opportunity to be at the forefront of preventing future cyber threats, to turn his painful experience into a force for good. As he pondered the decision, Zephyr found himself standing before the NCDA's memorial wall. A new name had been added since he last visited Raven Coe, his friend and colleague. Fatally wounded while protecting him during the final confrontation with the Syndicate, he placed a hand on her name, his touch gentle, almost reverent. "I'll make it count, Raven," he whispered. "I promise." Weeks later, Zephyr stood before the newly formed International Cyber Defense Coalition in Geneva. As he prepared to address the assembly and accept his new role, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The betrayal had nearly broken him, but it had also forged him into someone stronger, someone capable of protecting others from experiencing the same pain. Zephyr stepped up to the podium, his gaze sweeping across the gathered dignitaries and cybersecurity experts. When he spoke, his voice was steady, filled with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, the digital realm is our new front line. And on this front line, trust is both our greatest vulnerability and our strongest asset. Today, we start building a safer digital future, a future where betrayal cannot hide in the shadows of cyberspace." As his words resonated through the chamber, Zephyr felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He had transformed his personal tragedy into a powerful drive for global cybersecurity. The echoes of betrayal that had once threatened to destroy him had become the foundation of a new era of digital defense. In that moment, as he looked out over the faces of those who would join him in this fight, Zephyr Blackwood knew that this was just the beginning. The battle for the future of cyberspace lay ahead, and he was ready to lead the charge. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.